having welcomed you, Lesley, it also befalls me to thank you at this stage. And I was trying to make notes about just one or two points I wanted to include in the thanks, and I've almost run out of paper. But I think the thing that really struck me, because I have moved a number of times between disciplines, and I'm currently now in a fairly new discipline, is the notion of social justice as a praxis, and how I suppose the dominant discourse around social justice tends to relate to big social issues, and yet sometimes are the very small things that happen in our communities every day, and the ways in which action research can address the inequities in our practices and in the communities we work with is in itself a huge social justice practice. And praxis. So, I think that's something to take away from that makes it relatable to all other contexts. And I'm so glad, that you couched it in those terms. And, the terms that we all understand in classrooms: collective meaning making, giving voice to minority groups, to build the strong foundations before we start the actual bit of research, that we negotiate in the field before we actually start working there. So, I just found the whole thing just a wonderful refreshment as well of so many values that I believe we all hold dear as action researchers. And I'm just saying, I'm sure I've seen comments and questions throughout this popping up in the chat.
Jackie?
That was great, Lesley. I just loved it for a number of reasons. One, my work isn't generally with communities now. Most of it is I mentor individual, researchers around the world. But by influencing them, then they are influencing their communities. For example, Parvati in Nepal, she's having a massive influence now, which is really very encouraging. I have an interest in particular because I'm coming to South Africa in February, and I've been trying to read about, local conditions and about the culture, which has been a real focus of mine the last few years, trying to understand, for example, Nepalese cultures and their philosophies behind it. So you briefly mentioned Ubuntu. I've read the definitions, but you live it. So can you just talk for a minute about what's meant by Ubuntu?
I was actually told that the other day. A colleague of mine, an African colleague of mine, I can't remember what platform we were in, but he was talking about my work, and he says, this worked, and he's also doing it. Is really decolonizing. It's bringing an African perspective in through Ubuntu and so on. And I think that's our values. You're all doing Ubuntu. You just don't call it that because you're not in Africa. Ubuntu means, I am because you are. So as I said, it's a relational ontology. We cannot exist without each other. And in the same process, if you do something to destroy the planet, for instance, it affects me too. So we all have to work together, and we're all in it together. Unfortunately, in South Africa, Ubuntu is not being lived out in our communities because of the scarcity of resources. I see it disappearing. People are competing and actually killing each other for scarce resources. So we need to bring that back. And it's never really been in the university in South Africa. Our universities are very hierarchical, and all that kind of value attitudes that go with being in a university, without going into it too much. So Ubuntu, yes, and I think it's something that appeals to Jack as well. He always mentions that this is what we're doing. You're all doing Ubuntu. It's caring for and realizing we're all in this together, and we have to be empathic and not just be empathic, but actually work to support each other actively. And it's not really happening here at the moment. So I think it's even more important to reintroduce that to it.
What we usually do in the NEARI group, we'll split into breakout rooms and continue the discussion, and then come back to the plenary. So sorry, as people are popping back in, just
sorry, yeah.
No, to put it in context, for those that haven't been following the chat, because it's sometimes difficult, is that Mag submitted her PhD thesis. So she's just getting out of that tunnel. Yeah, so you had a point to make, Mags. You wanted to.
Yeah, do you know what I did, Katrina? You were in the group with me, and I actually hit leave the meeting instead of saying my thing. We were talking about acronyms and words, but actually the label, I get a bit jangly about the label that these are alternative, that we're living and working in an alternative method place. I think that it's kind of, we're evolving, it's evolving. And Conor made a really good point that you need to delineate between the positivist and whatever, but I think labeling, the label alternative or alternate is beginning to jar with me just a little bit. And Katrina, I still have that.
So just because I'm conscious of time and keeping a flow, I think in the schedule, this is meant to be the 5-minute kind of coffee break or stretch the legs time. But I think maybe just before that, if people wanted to share some of the discussion from their groups or.
Can I quickly mention, it's just that as I look at the screen and see all of our images, I was very aware in our breakout room about what we call the embodied expression of meaning and values. And I really enjoyed Leslie's presentation. Now, all the slides that Lesley showed were informative, but I'm just wondering whether we miss an opportunity in terms of this medium of digital visual data with this embodied expression of meaning and energy. So I just raised that as something to look at, because it's so exciting to see everybody, to listen and to watch the energy, to feel the enthusiasm and energy of the values base. So I'm just pointing that out as something we might look at later.
Perfect, thanks, Jack. Yeah, Jackie?
I just thought I'd mention in our small group, we actually had Lesley, and one of the things that I wrote down that might be of interest to the group is in this book of Leslie's, there's a whole chapter on ethics and ethical procedures, which often is difficult for many of our researchers. And I just thought maybe people might like to know about that.
I agree, Jackie. I think it's such an embodied and a dynamic process in action research. It's not that tick list that you get with an ethics committee. It's actually your way of being throughout the whole research, right from the very start. And even the fact, I think it was Carol who mentioned the fact that in Canada, you are expected to be invited to research with Indigenous groups, for example. You don't go in there as the expert. And that idea that, you know, we come into this work with humility, we come in listening, we come in willing to learn the whole way through, and we come in to do the work that is not what we decide is needed, but what communities themselves decide is needed. And I learned so much about that from Lesley, actually working in community work in South Africa, where, you know, before we did a thing, we worked with the community, relationship building, listening, strength building with the members of the community. And it was such an important part. Even practically, it's what helped to keep the research going, because people become very invested in it at that stage, and they realize that you're not just helicoptering in. We were quite surprised that we wanted to be called by our first names, for example. You know, there was so many indications that they expected a hierarchy, and disrupting that hierarchy, you know, was a very important process. And I agree too with Mags. I think, you know, this needs to be the normalized way of working. This is how people are in their lives. This is who we are as human beings. We're not, you know, objects to be manipulated in positivistic frameworks. Anyway, I'll say nothing more.
No, that's brilliant, Mary. And I just see Lesley has shared her email address in the chat. It's actually, it's all this interaction, keeping the chat, keep following it, but also listening to the conversations. But I might suggest maybe actually we'll break for maybe 3 minutes